I'm ready.
Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
and welcome to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. So glad to have you here. For those of you that this is your first time being here, just wanted you to know that every first and third Sunday we are free. It is sponsored by Fifth Third Bank. But I want to introduce you to our guest, Mr. Bob Cross. I call him Bob, so I have to make sure I get that in there. He's from Waynesville, Ohio. I met Mr. Cross because I am the manager of the Underground Railroad Committee. Robert has a house that's on the Underground that is a bed and breakfast, the John Evans House. He's going to talk to you a little bit about that, but he wants to talk to you about the indigenous people living in Ohio, and I'm going to let him take the stage. Welcome to Bob.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Like Novella said, my name is Robert Cross, and I am Inupiat. Now, Inupiat is Arctic Alaskan Eskimo. And I was born in Fairbanks, Alaska. This is a picture of me up in Fairbanks in, I believe, 1956. And when I tell people, you know, I get talking to people and they look at me and they say, you know, what nationality are you? And I tell them I'm Inupiat. They look at me kind of strange, you know. But then I say, that's Arctic. Hey, Tim. They look at me kind of strange and they think, and then I say, you know, that's Eskimo. And they go, oh, yeah, cool. So Eskimo actually is a term that was given to us by the Algonquin Indians in upper Northeast when the early fur traders were coming down the St. Lawrence River, and they were asking the Algonquin that they were and the Iroquois that they were trading with about the stories that they heard about the people who lived way up north. And the Algonquin called them Eskimo. It meant eaters of raw meat. It was never a derogatory term, so it kind of stuck, okay? But actually, I am Inupiat. The Arctic Eskimo that goes from Alaska across Canada and into Greenland are Inuit. But specifically, my tribe is Inupiat, which is Arctic Alaskan Eskimo. I was born in Fairbanks, Alaska, but my village is Tikiak. That's up above the Arctic Circle. It's on the Arctic Ocean. If you look on the map, it's called Point Hope. That's the American name. My village is Point Hope because my mother was born there. That's the earliest picture I have of her on the left. That is circa 1940, 1945, something like that. Her uncle and her aunt and their youngest daughter, and this big guy right here that I cut off the top of his head is a cousin. Notice the bobsled in the background. Now, I said I was born in Fairbanks. That was because my mother had came down from Tikiak. She was in the hospital there in Fairbanks. She had tuberculosis, and she was pregnant with me.
Oh, wow.
I was born with polio. My oldest brother, Fred, had tuberculosis also, and he was in a sanatorium. So my mom gave me up for adoption at birth, okay? And even though I'd been given up for adoption, my adopting parents, my mother who adopted me, she worked at the hospital where I was born. And shortly after that, her and my dad, or her husband, adopted me. And my mom was Irish, my dad was Cherokee. So, Tikiak is a coastal village on the Arctic Sea up above the Arctic Circle. This is a picture of Tikiak now in the summertime, and you can see there's no trees at all. It's pretty barren. And it is the oldest village on the North American continent. We know that for a fact because we have the oldest cemetery on the North American continent. DNA evidence from the cemetery and my descendants that live there now is a 100% match. But we were never taught that in school. Native American studies didn't exist at all when I was in school. I grew up in a Western culture and was taught that St. Augustine, Florida was the oldest city in North America. Not true. My ancestors inhabited Tikiak for over 1,000 years before a white man ever settled in North America at all. But our story has always been told without our voice. It's something that I've come to live with. Our nation had to create a narrative to justify the colonization of an entire continent, the entire Western Hemisphere. And in spite of the fact that the indigenous population had lived here for thousands of years before the white man ever set foot on American soil. This part of our history that none of us knew that much about, even myself, is not really a part of American history as we know of it, but it is a part of the history of mankind. And I think that is a story that needs to be told also. And our nation didn't create a very good narrative of the natives that lived here before the white man came. And this is a subject I'm very passionate about, but it's not the subject I'm talking about today, so I'll touch on that at another time. Tikiak is a village of almost 1,000 natives. There are no roads that lead to Tikiak, and even though it's a coastal village, the Arctic Sea, the Chukchi Sea, is right over here. Even though it's a native village, there's no port because it's too shallow. Everything has to be flown in. Therefore, the people there live what's called a subsistence of living lifestyle. They hunt whale, seal, walrus. They fish from the sea. Everything has to be flown in. There's one general store there where milk is $12 a gallon, and a 2-pound box of frozen ground beef patties is $24.
Wow.
They love basketball, and when the high school basketball team, both the girls and the boys high school basketball team have away games, they charter a flight to go to an away game. So bus drivers like Tim and I, we have no field trips up there. Now, this here is my niece. Her name is Diantha Aktalik. That's her boyfriend, Adam Sage. And she posted this picture on Facebook a few years back. And the caption underneath was, "I love it when my brother or my boyfriend takes me out on the sea on a calm day and I can listen to the whale callings." Listen to the whale callings. Can you imagine that? You know, we look at this lifestyle and we ask ourselves, why on earth is anybody going to live in a desolate place like that, let alone live there for thousands of years? They have a relationship with nature and with the cycle of the earth that many of us can't comprehend. I still have a hard time with that. This, by the way, is a sealskin boat, and it's Adam's. You can see his harpoon right there. My adopting father was in the Army. He was a career drill sergeant and a heavy equipment mechanic, and he was stationed up in Alaska at the time. And therefore, I lived on an Army base. When my dad passed away in 1958, my mother's family was from Michigan. So that's how I got down here to the lower 48. I grew up in a lower middle class, white Methodist environment, and I had a wonderful childhood. I truly did. But what little bit I knew about my culture and about my heritage, I learned from my mom, who was a white Irish woman that went up there to be with her husband, who happened to be stationed up there. So she didn't know that much about my history either. I didn't learn a whole lot until after my parents had passed. Now, being in a small rural white community and being the only person of color, I knew from the very beginning that I was a little different, you know. And I did get teased from time to time, but I never felt there was any malicious intent. You know, these are just kids being kids. When you remember when we were young, you got teased. Didn't matter if you were too tall or too short or overweight or whatever. Kids tease kids. I didn't learn that much about racial bias in our country until after I moved out of my neighborhood and I got older. But I do remember a time when I was real young, and my mom and I traveled to Florida for vacation. We went by car. This is because I loved to swim in the ocean. And on our way down, there were no interstates at that time. This was before the interstates. We traveled with a Texaco road map in our lap. And that's something you can never get folded back up, you know, when you're traveling. And it's true. And so therefore, because you weren't on the interstate, when you got out of your car at a filling station or at a diner, you stepped right into the world of the Deep South. Okay, and most of it was beautiful. It truly was. I have some wonderful memories of that. But I also remember one time when we stopped at a filling station, at a gas station. I went in to use the restroom. And I was pretty young, so my mom took me into the ladies' restroom. And when I came out of the stall, there was this old white woman arguing with my mom. And she was saying over and over again, you can't bring him in here, you can't bring him in here. Later, when my mom got me out of the car, she said, Bobby, I think you're old enough now, you're going to have to use the boys' room. You know, and I thought, okay, I'm all right with that. I'm a big boy now. But when I got in the car, I looked on the door of the restroom and it said whites only. My mom passed in 1985, and being an only child with a single mom, I struggled getting over the loss of my mom. It was really difficult for me. In 1971, the federal government, Richard Nixon, passed into law the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, giving back $963 million over 43 million acres of land and title to over 200 regional village corporations. This was huge. This settled a dispute over land claims that have been going on between the government and the Native Alaskans for over 100 years. But two things happened in the 1960s that really escalated the Alaskan Native claims as far as ancestral lands. The first one was in 1964 when a 9.2 magnitude earthquake struck south central Alaska in a rural area just north of Anchorage. To this day, it's still the largest earthquake to ever hit the North American continent. The U.S. government's Federal Relief Force, which is now FEMA, was sent to the area to assess the damage. And the primitive living conditions of the Native Alaskans that they found there made national headlines. This was the first time that our country as a whole got to see the living conditions of a group of Americans that they had never known anything about before. And the second, in 1968, the Atlantic Richfield Company discovered oil at Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic shore of the North Slope up in Alaska. When this happened, huge amounts of crude oil had to be transported across disputed ancestral lands 800 miles to the port of Valdez in southern Alaska. That, again, brought national attention to Alaska. And because of that, within 3 years, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was ratified and put into law. This was a landmark legislation for the U.S. government when dealing with native ancestral lands. They created 12 regional corporations that encompassed every region of the state. These native corporations still today have a say in everything that goes on in the state of Alaska, from tourism to national resources. Whenever the U.S. government, local or state government is discussing anything that has to do with land in Alaska, a Native representative is sitting at that table. This was huge. For the first time, Natives were able to remain on ancestral land, continue to practice and pursue an ancestral lifestyle, and also incorporate themselves in 21st century technology and share in its advantage. That was huge. In 2016, Robin Renfro, the Vice President of Human Resources and, let me make sure I get this right, Human Resources and Shareholder Relations from Doyon Limited, the Native corporation that I belong to. That's our logo right there. Doyon means wolf. It is Athabascan. Robin Renfro came down to Cincinnati, and in Blue Ash she held a meet and greet, and she invited all Native shareholders within a 200-mile radius to come to the meet and greet. Over 40 people showed up with their families. Well, you know, that's me right there. This was pretty cool because it was the first time in my life that I had ever met another Eskimo. And I was 64 years old back then. At the meeting, she discussed corporate business, updated names, addresses, emails, stock wills. We dined on Native ethnic food and then spent the rest of the day getting to know each other and swapping stories. And like I said, man, this is the first time I'd ever met another Eskimo. That, for me, was monumental. Later that day, she also asked if anyone had lost touch with their family up in Alaska, and I raised my hand. Within 2 weeks, she had put me in touch with my 4 siblings. I had 4 brothers and sisters that I knew nothing about. They all lived down here in the lower 48. And after 64 years of being an only child, I got to meet my 2 brothers and 2 sisters for the first time. My youngest sister, Jeanette, my oldest sister, Judy, my youngest brother, Chuck, my oldest brother, Fred. Fred was the one that was in the sanitarium with tuberculosis when I was born in Fairbanks. Fred has lived a very rough life. He's 78 years old now, and tuberculosis took its toll on that poor man's body. I also received a copy of my original birth certificate because when I was born, my birth certificate was changed to Robert Cross. I didn't know that. She sent me a copy of my original birth certificate, and my family name was Octaluk. Octaluk, that means whale hunter. When I called my youngest sister, Jeanette, for the first time, her daughter answered the phone, Janelle. And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, but Jeanette and Fred aren't home at the time, but they were awaiting my call." Robin Renfro had got in touch with them and told them that I was going to be calling one of my siblings. Now, they all knew that I existed because our mom had told her or told them that she had given up a child for adoption. But because of the privacy laws, you know, both sides really couldn't get in touch with the other. So they had no way of getting in touch with me. So as we were talking on the phone, all of a sudden, I hear Fred and Jeanette come home. And I could hear her say, Mom, you'll never guess who's on the phone." I get on the phone with Jeanette and we're both bawling, you know, and we're talking at the same time. It was quite an emotional moment. And then Fred gets on the phone, and Fred was a little confused because he remembered them telling, after Robin got in touch with them, that my original birth name was Eric. So for the longest time, when we get on the phone and talk, he was calling me Eric. And I didn't mind. you know, but I would hear Jeanette in the background saying, Fred, his name is Bob now. You need to call him Bob. I didn't mind. Now, one thing that did happen when I was talking to Fred is he told me that he and Jeanette had just came back from the funeral burying our father. And I says, oh my gosh, I'm really sorry to call it such a awkward time, you know, when feelings and emotions are frayed. And that's when he says, you know, sometimes, he says, life is cyclical. Sometimes when you lose a loved one, you gain another. And I never forgot that. Fred, this picture is in Phoenix, Arizona, or Glendale, Arizona, by the way. Fred and Jeanette lived together in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona. 2 Eskimos in Phoenix, Arizona. We visited them, Donna and I, my wife Donna's sitting right here, and the rest of my family. Donna and I visited them August of this last year. It was 110 degrees.
I was there.
People talk about I can't imagine living in Phoenix, Arizona, you know. I mean, people say, oh, it's dry. It's Phoenix, Arizona, it's 110 degrees. I don't care how dry it is. Anyways, Judy lives in northern Mississippi, and Chuck lives in St. Petersburg, Florida. I don't know. Anyways, in July of 2021, Donna and I flew to Alaska. We were on vacation, and we got in touch with my family up in Tikiak, and they were going to come down and visit. And I was going to meet some of my cousins and my nieces and nephews. And when we got off the plane there in Fairbanks, and I'm looking around, I says, Donna, look, Eskimos everywhere. You know, and I use the term Eskimo quite frequently. You know, this is what I grew up with. I know it may not be politically correct now. We should be using the term indigenous people. But for most of my life, I was an Indian. You know, Eskimo, Indian, they were interchangeable. Later, they referred to me as American Indian to differentiate between Eastern Indian. And then we were called Native Americans, and now it's indigenous people. I'm a little old-fashioned. I think indigenous is kind of an awkward term, but it is what it is. So I'm going to be using Indian. I'm going to use Native American. You might hear indigenous people if I start. So anyways, while we were in Fairbanks, we visited Robin Renfro and Doyen Limited, the corporate headquarters that I belong to, and we learned while we were there that Doyen Limited, our corporate headquarters, is right across the parking lot from St. Joseph's, or what used to be St. Joseph's Hospital in Fairbanks, where I was born. Right across the parking lot. I mean, how strange is that? A friend of mine from high school heard that we were coming up to Alaska. Yes. My wife's over here saying, Bob, you got to move along. We're getting behind. He says, you got a place to stay if you want to come up. It's just outside of Denali, and it's truly off the grid. He says, the only thing of it is, Bob, it's a dry cabin. And I says, I don't care. I don't drink anymore. And he says, no, Bob, a dry cabin means there's no running water.
Oh.
We had an outhouse.
Oh.
We had a pantry with these big 5-gallon jugs of water that we would put on the counter over the sink, and we'd draw water from that to cook or bathe with. And when we had to go to the restroom, we had one of the nicest outhouses I've ever been. It had truly. It had a porcelain toilet seat, and it had a linoleum floor.
Nice.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So anyways, I had a hard time convincing Donna to go there. She said, there ain't no way in heck I'm going to go stay in a place like that. As it turns out, this was during COVID. Airfare was really cheap. I was able to get round-trip tickets for, get this, $211 per person. Round trip, 4,000 miles to Fairbanks, Alaska. I convinced Donna to go, by upgrading to first class. We had first class seats, folks, for $1,100
Oh my
for
God.
both of us to Alaska. So, yeah, I know I should move on here. This right here is the view that I had from the front porch.
Nice.
This is in July, and it was daylight 24 hours a day. I would wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and my body clock was telling me it's 6 a.m. Ohio time, it's time to get up. So I'd get up and I'd fix a pot of coffee, and I'd go out and I'd sit at the picnic table, and I'd watch moose walk along that lagoon.
That's amazing.
It was awesome. It truly was. We also visited Denali National Park, and I remember Steve and Sasha trying to get in touch with us, and they were worried because there was no cell phone service. And you guys spent what, a day, half a day trying to find out what the heck happened to us. Denali National Park is over 6 million acres. It is over half the size of the state of Ohio. And it isn't even the largest national park in the state of Alaska. This place was awesome. Now, okay, see this mountain range right here? This is the Alaska Range. We had to cross that in order to get to the base of Denali on the tour bus. This is taller than the Appalachian Mountains. Not quite as tall as the Rocky Mountains. That's Denali. It's huge. It truly is. It's so big it creates its own weather. And most of you know Denali as Mount McKinley, okay, right? Most of you know Mount McKinley. As it turns out, in the end of in the late 1890s, the campaign manager of William McKinley, who was going to run for president, was in Alaska on vacation. And when he was just outside of Fairbanks, and he was looking at the mountain, he wanted to know the name of this majestic mountain that he was looking at. The white locals there said, I don't know. I don't think it has a name. The Athabascans had called this Denali, the Great One, for 2,000 years. It has always been Denali. But he goes back to Washington, D.C., sponsors some legislation to have the name to be Mount McKinley. It was passed into law, and it wasn't until 2015. And William McKinley never even visited Alaska. That's what really upset me. So it wasn't until 2015 when Barack Obama had the name officially changed back to Denali. When we were up there, and I was talking to the natives about that, you know, I was trying to tell them how angry that made me feel, you know, that our government would do stuff. They said, don't worry, it's Denali. It's always been Denali. It always will be Denali. And I'm saying, yeah, but you know what? And they would shake their head. They had a way of processing everything that has happened in to their culture, to their people for so long. Stuff like that just doesn't faze them. It sure did me, though. So, I know I'm getting a little off track here. So after a week of wilderness living, oh yeah, this is a picture. We were on a trail. This was in Denali National Park, and hopefully I can get this. Oop. No. Maybe not. I'm supposed to show you guys a moose walking across there. Imagine you're
We
looking
believe
at a
you.
big cow walking right in front of us, and we're out there on the trail, and we're thinking we're the only ones out there. And then all of a sudden, a big moose comes walking by. Sorry, can't show it to you. So anyways, after a week of living in the wilderness, Don and I drove down to Anchorage to visit family members who came down from Tiki Island. These are all cousins. That's my niece, Diantha, the picture of her that was in my third slide. You know, the big close-up? That's Diantha right here. Edith Rivera right here is a sculptor. And she has soapstone carvings.
Yes, we will be drawing our
on display at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. It's really
If
pretty
you
cool.
have not yet entered, please bring your
Sure.
completed vendor passport down to the front desk and we will get you entered. Good luck, everybody.
When we met at this coffee shop, we all exchanged gifts, and I brought Waynesville honey. You know, we live in Waynesville. We got this honeybee farm, and there's no trees above the Arctic Circle, so therefore there's no honeybees. That gift was a big hit. I should have brought more. 1, 2, 3. I think we bought 6 jars, something like that. But they thought that was just cool as all get out. Okay, they gave us our Eskimo names. The Eskimo name they gave me was Oktalek, the whale hunter. I felt like my life had come full circle. So
Did you get it?
we spent the next 2 days getting to know each other. I learned both how different and how similar our lives and our cultures truly are. Dealing with family and friends in most cultures is the same everywhere. You know, it can be a challenge. And I tried to relate to them how much I care about caring for the land and protecting our natural resources and protecting our wildlife. And I said to them, I love to go bass fishing. But when I catch bass, I always practice catch and release. I thought I was saying something that was rather profound. They all looked at me rather strangely, and I didn't learn until afterwards that whenever they hunt or fish, they always give thanks to the Great Spirit for providing food and clothing and whatever. And they never hunt or fish for sport. That would be disrespectful. I didn't know that. Now, while attending, we left there after 2 or 3 days, and it was quite an experience. I got to meet a lot more of my siblings than just my 3 cousins and my niece. But I want to get back to home here in Waynesville. This is our home. And while attending the Sauerkraut Festival in 2009, how many of you, by the way, have been to the Sauerkraut Festival? Anybody? Okay, it's a lot of fun. It truly is. While we attended there in 2019, there were 2 houses that were available, each on the opposite end of town, but both of them in the historical area. This one right here is a John Evans house. It's on the National Historical Registrar, and my wife fell in love with it. And I says, what on earth are we going to do with a 5-bedroom home? You know, the kids are all grown. There's just the 2 of us. Well, we ended up turning it into a bed and breakfast. Okay, my wife and I live downstairs. We have a 4-bedroom Airbnb upstairs. We serve a gourmet breakfast on the weekends. And when Steve and Sasha and the grandkids all moved away to southern Alabama a few years back, but they're back here now, thank goodness. When they moved away, it left a big hole in our lives, and all of a sudden this house becomes available, and we threw ourselves into it. And now we're, what's the word we were called? Not caretakers. Innkeepers. Thank you. Who said that? Yes, innkeepers. We were now innkeepers. I've been called a lot of things, but never that. I thought I enjoyed that. So, anyways, this is a historical marker that is in our front yard, and it reads David and Rachel Burnett Evans built this federal-style house in 1836. Their son, Dr. John Evans, nationally known physician, statesman, and educator, lived here as a young man. After graduating from Lynn Medical College in Cincinnati, Dr. Evans became a prominent physician in Indiana and helped establish the Indiana Hospital for the Insane. He is recognized as one of the founders and first president of Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. He was appointed by President Abraham Lincoln as the first governor of the Colorado Territory. That's a mistake, by the way. He was the second governor of the Colorado Territory, and is credited for developing the railroad system in Colorado. His desire to institute a system of higher education in the territory led to the founding of the Colorado Seminary, later known as Denver University. Evanston, Illinois, and Mount Evans on the Rocky Mountains near Denver were named in his honor. Now, as governor of the Colorado Territory, he was also appointed to be the supervisor of Indian Affairs, which is what Bureau of Indian Affairs is now. One man cannot hold both offices simultaneously. They are on opposite ends of the political and cultural spectrum. Now, as governor of the territory of Colorado, John Evans' agenda was twofold. One was to help make Colorado a state and probably become the first governor of the state of Colorado. And the second was to see the Transcontinental Railroad run through Denver. Indian affairs were nothing more than a hindrance in achieving those goals. All this correspondence from Washington to Denver reflected those goals. When the Indians didn't cooperate, he ordered the Army to remove them from the territory by any means necessary. The result was the Sand Creek Massacre. Over 240 women, children, and elderly men who were awaiting relocation sent to Sand Creek by John Evans were slaughtered and their bodies mutilated by a volunteer army. 2 congressional hearings and a military investigation determined that what had happened was not only unnecessary, but it was egregious. John Evans was removed from office by President Andrew Johnson. The history books recorded that John Evans was exonerated because no one was ever held accountable. John Evans is a hometown hero in Waynesville, and the locals don't want that part of the history of our history made public. Some accuse me of trying to destroy the reputation of a great statesman. All I wanted to do was tell the whole story. Now, this research led me down a rabbit hole that sometimes I wish I hadn't gone. As I started my journey investigating our claim that our home was a safe house for the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, and it was, John Evans' parents were Quakers. Most Quakers were abolitionists. I learned that there was a tunnel used to help fugitive slaves enter our home behind the stairs in our cellar. There is a big cement slab up here on top, and when you remove that cement slab and you climb down this ladder, you can see the storm drain. But you can also see the original frame of the Underground Railroad. There's controversy over these claims because most times records were never kept documenting any involvement in harboring of slaves because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Anyone convicted of harboring escaped slaves could be prosecuted and face imprisonment and loss of property. So while researching the Underground Railroad, I became increasingly aware of the parallels between the Black and Native American history and the impact on racial prejudice that we had experienced. I had also happened to meet the great-great-granddaughter of Evan Evans, John Evans' youngest son. She was traveling from Virginia to Denver, researching her family tree. On her return home, she brought us a couple of books and some articles on John Evans and his association with the Sand Creek Massacre. That's just one book that I have right here. It goes into a great deal about that massacre at Sand Creek. The title says How Methodists Were Involved in American Tragedy. It gets a little out there when it talks about the religious part of it. Yes? 5 minutes? Okay. Gonna have to wrap this up. When she brought this information back, and she also visited the battlefield where the massacre occurred, this brought what happened in Colorado to our doorstep. When I started doing all of this research, I also began researching in all the battles, Native American and the colonial battles. And I thought I knew a lot about that part of our history, but I wasn't prepared to learn about all the atrocities that happened. I began having these awful nightmares. I began having nightmares that I was being chased by these good old boys, and when I was caught, I was killed and my body was mutilated. I began having nightmares about being chased by bears, by a bear, one single bear. He was always chasing me, but he never caught me. my nightmares got so bad that a couple times I woke up in the middle of the night screaming and thrashing, and I hit my wife Donna, and she had to move upstairs to a bedroom for a period of time. And we got talking about this finally, and Donna says, you know, I had to stop that kind of research. I mean, I'd learned enough, and it was taking its toll. But I was still confused about the bear chasing me. And then one thing that Donna said was she suggested the dream subconsciously may be trying to tell me something. Maybe the bear wasn't trying to catch me. Maybe he was trying to find me. Perhaps it represented my culture revealing itself. And once we started talking and having the dialogue along those lines, I don't have those nightmares anymore. Now, this journey has been very difficult for me at times. It has made me angry and depressed at times. But it also reunited me with my biological family. Nothing could ever diminish that joy. It has been a wonderful journey. And I want to close by saying how proud I am to be Native American. And I want to remind everybody that we are still here, the First Nations, the first Americans. Thank you.
I want to thank Bob. Our time is short. If you have a couple of questions for him, you can come by and talk to him. But in the age of America, where we still talk about freedom, we have to realize until we tell the truth about America's history and we be okay with it and live and learn from it and grow from it, America, even though we say it's free, will never be. Thank you, Bob, for coming.
bet.
We appreciate you being here.
I enjoyed it.
And if you don't know about the history of the Underground Railroad, Ohio was the biggest Underground Railroad network there was because of the Ohio River. Looking at it now, it's wide and it's deep, but back during that time, they hadn't put a dam in it, so that river was very narrow and very low when escaped people or freedom seekers ran to the Ohio River during the fall and the winter. They found that some areas in the Ohio River was so low that you could wade in it, wade in the water, Underground Railroad, or it would be completely frozen. So Ohio became the network for the Underground Railroad. And a matter of fact, the term Underground Railroad actually came from Ohio, from Ripley, where there was a man trying to get his freedom. His master saw him going up the hill in Ohio, in Ripley, Ohio. He went behind him, knocked on doors, and everybody said, nope, ain't seen nobody look like that. And so he went back and said, he must have disappeared underground. And that's how the term Underground Railroad Network came from. So when they were looking for the escapees, they all ran to the railroad tracks expecting them to be on the railroad. And so anytime, with Ohio, we're always looking for the houses. And so if you think you have a site, I'm gonna tell you now, if you see a big tunnel, that is not an Underground Railroad, okay? Underground Railroads, the tunnels were so evasive that you wouldn't have been able to see it. So if you have a small area, and we know that where Waynesville is at in Springboro actually have 28 houses that is on Main Street, and they actually had tunnels that went from house to house because they were so, because you had Lebanon and Franklin in the middle, and then they sent them from Springboro to Waynesville. So from Ohio River, they went through probably Ripley and Glendale, going through Springfield, going through Springboro, Waynesville, and then sending them up through Columbus, going all the way up into Cleveland area. So it depended on who you met here in Ohio that you would have found. So you could have met somebody that would have sent you this way. You could also met somebody that would have sent you to Indiana going up into Ohio, to Canada. So Ohio became the Underground Railroad nub. The reason for the Freedom Center being here, this was called Little Africa. Free African Americans lived here and worked off of that river. We have the nickname Porkopolis because of that. Where the bingo stadium is at, that was Little Bucktown, another African American community. Fifth Street on down was the third African American community. So we're on sacred ground. And we want to thank you again for coming, for listening to Bob. Please ask him some questions. He'll be here for a little bit, right, Bob?
Absolutely.
And make sure you shop down on the second floor. If you're just coming up from slavery to freedom, from the beginning of slavery in America to the end of the Civil War. This is talking about slavery today because we have more people enslaved in the world than there's ever been. And then we call it the invisible slavery because you can see somebody on the street and not realize that they have been a victim of that. So we need to keep our eyes open. Also, in the second floor is geared to the Underground Railroad. We have an artist here, Brent Billingsley, and he's downstairs by the third floor. Make sure if you have kids that you visit them. And I'm here, and anybody else that you see in a black shirt or walking around looking like they might belong, just ask them if they do, and we can get you some help, okay? Thank you again for coming to see us.
I do have some brochures about our bed and breakfast. I am shamelessly plugging mine. Oh, absolutely. There you go. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
My name is Paxton. I
Excellent.
obviously work at Native Alaskan.
I gathered that.
Yes, but